All right, welcome to the next principle, which is all about focusing, because this is a slightly debatable topic still in landscape photography. That's because there's this concept which is called as the hyperfocal distance. Okay, it's a slightly technical topic. I'm not going to get deep into that. I'm just going to be telling you this in a very, very easy to understand manner, that what exactly is this and why does this just cause a bit of debate in the photography world, in the landscape photography world. So where to focus in a landscape shot? Okay, so let's see a shot first of all. So I'm sure if you've ever done landscape photography, you must have faced this problem that we are seeing in this shot, which is if you look at the shot, yes, it's got a good composition that we just learned about in the last video. You've got the foreground, you've got the middle ground, you've got the background, but if you see the foreground, especially those elements which are very close to the camera, they are coming out to be a bit blurred, right? Now, think of it like this. I'm assuming that, of course, you just have very basic knowledge about how aperture works, right? Aperture controls the amount of depth of field. That means how many things are in focus. Later on, when we specifically talk about aperture in a later principle which will come, we'll obviously be seeing that in landscape photography, we use higher f-stop numbers or a narrower aperture. That means because those higher f-stop numbers give us more area in focus, which is obviously important in landscape photography, as opposed to, let's say, portrait photography, where you want to blur the background, and you want to have a very less area in focus, so we usually use small f-stop numbers or wider aperture. So for landscape photography, a bigger depth of field is necessary. So that is pretty understood, right? But also one very important thing is, where are you going to focus? Because the depth of field will also be generated. You can think of it like this: wherever you focus, that's around where the depth of field starts to generate. For example, in this case, okay, if I'm just giving you an example, if we were to place our focus point somewhere on these flowers in the foreground, then what will happen is you might just see the opposite effect. That means the background behind may not be as sharp in this case. Okay, that's because the depth of field will be more concentrated and more of this area will be in focus, right? If you focus exclusively only on the sky, that means the background, okay, if you place your focus point somewhere here, more of this area might just go out of focus, okay? So if we take both these scenarios, it kind of makes slightly common sense that if we place the focus point somewhere in between, that is going to give us a nice balance of that depth of field, right? A bit of sharpness on the background, a bit of sharpness on the foreground. That particular point where you get the best balance is what hyperfocal distance means in a very easy to understand manner. So now the question is, do you exactly have to find out the point where you have to focus? Well, some landscape photographers actually do that. They carry different formulas and charts which tells them, yes, this is exactly where the hyperfocal point is. A lot of cameras allow you to do that by monitoring the depth of field. We don't want to get into that, okay? I'll exactly tell you later on in this video itself, where should you focus in order to at least get somewhere just around the hyperfocal distance mark, okay? That's usually somewhere going to be, in between, but not exactly that. I'll just be telling you about that later on. But first of all, I just want to show you a few images, some other images, which just demonstrates whatever I just talked about, okay? So these three images that I'm just going to be showing you will just kind of make things slightly easier to understand. So here we have this image which says hyperfocal distance. It's just like, a printout of a photo. And this will actually make you understand the same thing, that in this page, okay, so when you click this page, you just, would have focused somewhere in the front part, right? Because that is what is sharp and the behind part is blurred. Let's look at a different image. So this time you can see that if we focus on the back part of the page, the front part becomes a bit blurred. So what will be the hyperfocal distance will be something like this, that you focus somewhere in the middle so that most of area, apart from the very extremes on the foreground and the background, will be in focus. So that's why the hyperfocal distance is popular in landscape photography, because again, it just gives you a good balance between the background and the foreground sharpness. So now the question is, where do you exactly focus? So this is a slightly debatable topic, okay, but usually I'm telling you what is done as a rule of thumb, what most of the landscape photographers follow, okay? If you're, let's say, shooting a scene like this, Most of the landscape photographers, including myself, what we do is that we basically, if you imagine this shot to be in a grid, and you can actually activate the rule of the thirds grid. Every camera has that. You can find it how to activate on your own camera. So you can actually will be able to see a grid like this. And then what you do is you basically focus from 1/3 from the bottom. Okay, so like you can see this image is being divided into 3 parts, right? The grid does that. So from the bottom, what is that 1/3 part? Somewhere around this line. So 1/3 from the bottom to up. That's how it is. Okay. So if we are just, even if you're just looking at an image without a grid, you can just kind of take a guesswork that yes, 1/3 will be somewhere around this region, right? That's what the reason is. This is what people follow without doing all those calculations, but that yes, the hyperfocal distance, which gives the best balance between the background and the foreground, will be somewhere around this point. Okay, so people just go for that. Now the question you must be thinking, Kush, why isn't it in the middle? Okay, now that is where hyperfocal distance, the concept becomes really technical. It has got to do something with, when we talk about focusing to infinity, which happens at the background and all these things. But in a very simple to understand manner, what I can just tell you is that we're kind of giving more preference to the foreground, okay? Because we 100% want to make sure that the hyperfocal distance covers as much of the foreground as possible. Why? Because it's easier for it to cover the background because the background is farther away. If that did not make sense, don't worry about it. Just remember this thing, that we will be focusing, even when I go out on the field and I take the shot, we will be focusing somewhere around 1/3 from bottom up. Now, having said that, before I learned hyperfocal distance a lot of years back, I used to just focus in the center somewhere, okay? It still resulted in okay images with good balance between the background and the foreground. So it's not the end of the world if you don't follow this absolutely to the T, okay? But now that you know it, you can definitely at least take an approximate and focus here, okay? It's just gonna give you a much better balance. Let's put it that way. Also worth noting that you don't always have to follow. If, for example, if in your shot you have some particular important focal point, maybe there was a lighthouse somewhere here, maybe there was some important object here, and you 100% wanted to make sure that that has to be the sharpest thing in the shot, you can ignore this 1/3 thing, the hyperfocal distance thing, and make sure you focus on that and get that sharpest, okay? So sometimes things can override the usual principles in landscape photography. Also, talking about hyperfocal distance cannot finish till the time we address one important issue, which I'm going to talk about right now. Now, remember, we saw this shot before, and what we saw was that these leaves, right, they were very close to the camera, almost as close to the flowers that were blurred out in the picture that we just saw, the first picture in this video, right? But in this case, you can see it's really very sharp, right? It's not blurred out at all. Now, even if you follow, so you must be thinking, Kush, definitely this person has got their hyperfocal distance correct and they're focused at the correct place. No. Even if you manage to do that, if something is too close to the lens, like really, really close to the lens, it's still not going to give you a perfect result like this. So then you must be asking, Kush, then how has this person got? Okay, so here's the thing. You can use the best hyperfocal distance, the most accurate one, but like I said, if things are too close, it's still going to be blurred. So what we do in this case is, if we want 100% of the shot to be absolutely sharp from front, right from here to absolutely back, we actually don't take just one shot. What we do is, we take one shot in which we focus only on the foreground. We ignore that hyperfocal distance rule, okay? We absolutely just focus in this case on the rocks, okay? Then let's say we take one shot which will be covering some area where we focus somewhere here. Then we'll take one shot where the focus point is somewhere in the center. Then we'll take one shot which is at the back, okay? And then let's say if you've got 5 shots, I'll be showing you later on in Photoshop how to combine these shots by using a technique called as focus stacking, okay? In that, Photoshop, what it'll do is it'll just analyze those 5 shots and it'll only pick out those areas from each shot where the shot was absolutely sharp. Wherever the shot lost focus, it'll just abandon that shot. So you will basically get a merged shot of all the areas in focus, okay? Right now, this is a slightly advanced concept, the concept of focus stacking, okay? But Many landscape photographers use it to override the problems with hyperfocal distance. Okay, we are going to be seeing this actually. That time you'll understand it in a much better way. Right now, just wanted to at least tell you that this concept also exists. Okay. Anyway, this was slightly technical. This was slightly tough. So if you did not understand whatever I just told you fully, it's completely fine. Things will become easier as we move down the course. But right now, I'll see you in the next video where we will tackle another principle.